is Eric Lerner, and then it'll be Marcy Smith Parenti. And Eric, just make sure Marcy is has access to the share screen as well.
Right, I think she already does.
Okay, she is great, great.
Let me. Marcy, you should, okay. All right, you should see this now as your co-host. Okay, so can I start?
Yes, go ahead, Eric.
Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the relationship between the fascism and the fascist movement of today, especially in the period of the pandemic, and the fascist movements of the 20th century. So what is the key idea of fascism? The key idea of fascism is the complete centrality of the individual. The basis of society is atomized individuals, and the strong individual must dominate the weak. From this flows a rigidly hierarchical authoritarian society in which each strong individual obeys those over him and has complete domination of those under him. And this relationship between individualism and fascism, don't take my word for it. Let's hear from a leading theorist of 20th century fascism. So let's see whether we can get this. So I hope people are seeing just this, my share screen, right?
Yes, yes, that's what we're seeing.
So quoting this individual, the movement must use all possible means to cultivate respect for the individual personality. It must never forget that all human values are based on personal values and that every idea and achievement is the fruit of the creative power of one man. Human progress and human culture are not founded by the multitude. They are exclusively the work of personal genius and personal efficiency. Man must realize that a fundamental law of necessity reigns throughout the whole realm of nature, and that his existence is subject to the law of eternal struggle and strife. He will then feel that there cannot be a separate law for mankind, where the strong are always masters of the weak, and where those subject to such laws must obey them or be destroyed. The expert continues, but such preservation goes hand in hand with the inexorable law that it is the strongest and the best who must triumph, and they have the right to endure. He who would live must fight. He who does not wish to fight in a world where permanent struggle is the law of life has not the right to exist. Therefore, in its organization, the state must be established on the principle of personality, starting from the smallest cell and ascending up to the supreme government of the country. So the end of that quote. So the psychological appeal of this fascist ideology is the identification of the individual with the leader, with the strongest. And it means giving up real autonomy for the satisfaction of dominating others, down to, of course, the scapegoated individuals who can be dominated by anyone and, if necessary, physically destroyed. In 20th century fascism, this fundamental antisocial celebration of the individual was tied with the idea of the sacrifice of the individual to the mystical community of the Volk. The interests of the Volk were very vague, but were determined exclusively by the leader. So to go back to our expert, since true idealism is essentially the subordination of the interests in life of the individual to the interests in life of the community, this idealism accords in its innermost essence with the final purpose of nature. This feeling alone makes men voluntarily acknowledge that strength and power are entitled to take the lead, and thus makes them a constituent particle in that order out of which the whole universe is shaped and formed. So we have the idea that the sacrifice of the people for the folk, for the sacrifice of the individual for the folk or the people, boils down to acknowledging the leadership of the strong at all levels. According to our leader, whose name many of you may have guessed is Adolf Hitler, and these are quotes from an English translation of his book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Fascism emerged in the 20th century after World War I as an ideology of despair. It was the despair that the socialist left, workers' organizations, or even indeed any of the organizations of society could actually benefit the individual. Cooperation had failed, trust had collapsed. Out of this despair arose the fascist glorification of the strong individual who subordinated himself only to the stronger. In this way, the radical opposition to capitalism of the millions of adherents of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, the Nazi Party, and the millions more who adhered to the fascist parties worldwide were mobilized in the service of capitalist dictatorships that enslaved tens of millions, killed tens of millions, and enriched thousands of capitalists. In the process of nearly destroying civilization and nearly plunging the world into a dark age during the course of World War II. So let's look at fascism today. 21st century fascism also centralizes the idea of individuals' strength. It is what I call the ideology of me-firstism. Freedom to this ideology means allowing the strong to do as they like. Those who are strong will survive COVID. It's not even a threat to the strong. The strong can kill the weak in self-defense, as we see in the Arbery and Rittenhouse cases. The strong can protect their own bodies from invasion by vaccine, but have the right to dominate the bodies of the weak, force women to have sex with them, force them to have children that they don't want, and so on. Masking and vaccination during the pandemic, quarantines, are particular threats to the sense of individual strength, since vaccines are obviously the product of the effort of the entire society, and masking and quarantine imply an obligation to others, and also that the virus is in fact a risk to all. So anti-masking and anti-vaccine movements, which have been strongly promoted by the right wing, feed into the basic fascist ideology that the strong must be free to do as they like, to look after themselves, and that their freedom is the freedom to oppress the weak. If you get COVID because I cough, it's obviously because you are weak and I am strong. That's also, we have the deathbed conversions of the anti-vaxxers who actually get COVID and realize too late that they are not among the strong. But the anti-vaccine and anti-masking, the COVID is conspiracy, feeds not only among right-wingers, openly, people who are openly advocates of right-wing quasi-fascist ideology. The ideology of I am strong so I can do everything I like to you. The anti-vaccine, anti-masking also appeals to the left-wing individualism and the New Age self-help movement. The we can do it yourselves utopianism that Jay and I personally encountered in the leadership of Occupy Wall Street. Again, these movements, whether right or left in rhetoric, reflect a collapse of trust in all social action. Even protest is mainly a route to withdrawal from society, not for social transformation. All of these movements are profoundly anti-statist, but beyond that, they are deeply anti-social. Society has betrayed them, so they can only count on themselves, not try to change society, which requires trusting others in a movement. I suspect Marcy will talk more about this, so I won't go into it any further. Despite the deep ideological commonalities of 21st century fascism and 20th century models, the movement today has severe weaknesses. The collapse of the prestige of the military through the long wars reinforced rather than undermining the so-called Vietnam syndrome. This has left the new fascist movement of the 20th century without a concept of a strong hierarchy or of sacrifice for a mystical folk. We can see examples of this. For example, look at January 6th. There could have been a real coup if a half dozen determined and disciplined individuals with fully automatic weapons had shot enough Democrats to leave a Republican majority. Trump could have been reelected at gunpoint. But the idea of such headlines appearing in any journal other than The Onion is clearly ridiculous, not only because of Trump's own scatterbrained personality, but the lack of discipline of these quasi-militias like the Proud Boys. Second example, can anybody imagine Adolf Hitler laughing awkwardly as Donald Trump did when his own followers loudly booed him for suggesting that they get vaccinated? Clearly today, the cult of the individual, me-firstism, dominates even over the cult of the savior. The current movements lead to the vigilantism of the Mad Max movies, not to the sort of disciplined fascist regimes that occurred in the 20th century. We see this, for example, in the Texas abortion laws, which actually legalized vigilantism. These weaknesses have prevented, so far, a fascist movement from taking over any major country. But of course, ideological viruses can mutate as biological ones can. So this is not a guarantee. Unfortunately, capitalism does not need fascist movements in power for capitalism to stay in power. What it needs is a fascist movement to keep the working class divided. Tucker Carlson and other employees of Rupert Murdoch and of all the right-wing capitalists are pushing anti-vaccine, anti-masking, the whole COVID is hoax conspiracy theory, because like the anti-abortion movement, it divides the working class. It sets workers at each other's throats. It destroys the trust needed to build a movement that can threaten capitalist power and capitalist theft. This is precisely why today, a section of the capitalist class is supporting these fascist ideologies. They know that the developing global capitalist crisis, which we talked about in the last teaching, will require a downward spiral of working class standards of living and even existence. At the same time, capitalist wealth becomes more and more nakedly dependent on theft mediated by the state. To prevent the rise of a movement that demands that this theft stop, that threatens the very basis of capitalist power, the capitalists need diversions and division. Workers fighting each other. We see this in miniature in the many school boards that can't talk about improvements or even maintenance of education because of the anti-masking ranting. We see this on a large scale when people talk about what will happen if Roe v. Wade is overturned and states pass laws allowing any man to force any woman to bear his child. Unless, of course, the woman has resources to flee to a free state. Allowed to grow, these fascist ideologies destroy the possibility of working class resistance to the capitalist destruction. They destroy our ability to preserve the very existence of the working class, to preserve the survival of civilization itself. So again, as with Les, the question is, how do we counter? First, we have to explain that capitalist individualism is a lie. Capitalist power has never rested on the power of individual capitalists. It's always been based on their collective control of the state, protecting capitalist power. Today, it is the capitalists, based on their collective control of the government, the Republicans and the Democrats, that are funneling $120 billion a year directly from the state to a handful of billionaires. That is through their collective control of the governments of China, of Europe, of Japan, of the United States. As the song goes, they have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn. Their strength comes from that collective control, not from individual strength. So the idea of individualism is itself based on a lie. And we have to explain that to those who are sucked into this individualist ideology. Second, we have to isolate the hardcore of the anti-vaxxers and the anti-maxxers by exposing the real facts and the real intent of breaking up the workers' movements while the capitalists steal trillions. This is a huge diversion. We have to explain that. It's not true that anti-vaxxers can't be changed by facts. Here is an interesting statistic. I want people to guess how many Americans aged 65 to 74, my own personal age group, have had at least one shot against COVID. According to CDC, the answer is 100%. Obviously, they're rounding, but it means less than 0.5% of that entire age group has refused to get vaccinated, no matter what their ideologies are. They see before their eyes the lies that they have been told. They see their friends and relatives dying because they are unvaccinated. So facts can persuade. And finally, we explain to the many millions of people who would never want to be identified with the fascist movement that the idea of the strong individual has led and must lead to fascism, the opposite of freedom, as it did in the past century. We isolate the very small hardcore who would have no problem with identifying with the words of Adolf Hitler. So finally, we get to the question, what is real freedom? And we're going to go into this more in the next teaching. But the most important way, in my view, to explain what real strength and real freedom means is our ability to act in unison, to cooperate. All of humanity's achievements have been achieved through cooperation. Even our very human ability to speak to each other has been achieved through cooperation. Every word we say has been invented by some other human being. Real strength and real freedom comes from the realization, again, quoting the song, without our brains and muscles, not a single wheel will turn. It is our collective power that gives us freedom. And that idea that strength comes from our power to work has become more prominent with the pandemic that has dramatized the shortage of workers, the dependence of the entire world economy on the ability of people to produce goods and to move goods to their final destination. But real freedom can only come through the participation in a democratic mass movement where individuals can make contributions to the direction of the mass movement. In the 1930s, the German Communist Party, the KPD, the German Socialist Party, the SPD, could not fight the anti-democratic rhetoric of the fascists because they were anti-democratic in their own organization. Only through delegated deliberative bodies in a mass movement can we fight and defeat fascism, as again we'll go into in the next teaching. Rulers do not fear individuals. They fear people acting collectively. What do authoritarian regimes ban? They ban mass protests, they ban strikes. What is banned in the United States right now is effective strikes. Unification can only come when we make common demands on the corporations and the governments. We have to demand to expand the cooperative role of governance, because every society needs governance to run it, and minimize the coercive role of the state, the body of armed men that enforces capitalist rule. And what we mean by cooperation is cooperation for the benefit of the workers, not the billionaires. We mean diverting the $120 billion to fighting the pandemic, to building up public health, to building up housing, transportation, to building up aid to the rest of the world. We need to fight for higher wages, countering speed up, overcrowding, overwork, all of which contributes to the spread of the pandemic. Again, we'll discuss more on program in the next week's teaching. The threat to freedom comes not from the existence of the government. The threat comes from the fact that the capitalists run the government and the capitalists control the government. The Chinese government controls the owns and controls the financial sector, but they run the financial sector for the benefit of the billionaires who control the Chinese Communist Party, which should be named the Chinese Capitalist Party, or CCP. It is only through mass movements that capitalist governments have been forced to give concessions to cooperative ventures like Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure projects, public education that benefit the working class. In the process of maximizing cooperation and minimizing coercion, we cannot overnight eliminate coercion from a capitalist society. We all presumably agree on the necessity for traffic laws, which have to be enforced by some means. The same with vaccination mandates, with masking mandates. They have to be enforced by some means. Under capitalist society, cooperation too has to be in some way coerced, but it is in our interest to minimize that coercion, just like we should demand that traffic cops not be armed to give you a traffic ticket. We should also demand the minimization of the coercion needed to enforce public health mandates. Obviously, the mandates today about employment are working pretty well. France has had great success with even less coercion, with vaccine passes that prohibit people who are unvaccinated from going to restaurants and other public places. So to conclude, basically, what is real freedom? Real freedom is socialism. Real freedom is the ability of the individual to participate democratically in the running of society and the running of the economy at all levels. That is the concept of freedom that we have to counterpose to the individualist concept of freedom, which leads to fascism. So, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And now we're going to turn over to our